Imagine a land where whispers carry the weight of gunfire, where a single name is enough to freeze a village in silence. That name was Bakoura. For years, he was more than a man. He was a shadow, a ghost who seemed untouchable. Mothers in northern Nigeria told their children to stay close, warning, "Bakoura walks at night." Soldiers along the Lake Chad Basin cursed his name in frustration as ambushes left their comrades buried in the sand. In dusty classrooms, teachers prayed every morning that today would not be the day armed men burst through the doors. Bakoura was the heir to Boko Haram's most ruthless commander, Abubakar Shekau. Where Shekau left fire, Bakoura carried the embers and made them burn brighter. His legacy was not speeches or political manifestos. It was villages left in ashes, children stolen in broad daylight, and marketplaces turned into graveyards. The most haunting of these crimes came in March 2024. In a quiet town called Kuriga, more than 300 school children were herded onto trucks, their uniforms stained with dust and tears. The images spread across the world, but for families in West Africa, it was another chapter in a nightmare that seemed endless. Parents waited by empty desks. Communities emptied in fear. And through it all, Bakoura's legend grew stronger. The man who could not be caught, the phantom who always returned. But on August 15th, 2025, that legend was tested. In the marshlands of Chilawa, Niger's armed forces prepared a gamble that many thought impossible. Their target was not just a man, but a myth. Their mission was not simply military. It was existential. At dawn, the desert sky trembled. 3 bombs fell like thunder. Villagers miles away described the sound as rainless storms rolling across the horizon. When the dust settled, word spread, Bakoura was gone. Not in rumor, not in speculation, but in fire. This was not just an airstrike. It was a rupture in history. A moment when Niger, often dismissed as a junior partner in someone else's war, declared its own sovereignty with unmistakable force. But victory is never simple in the Sahel. The question that hangs in the air is this: if Bakoura has fallen, what future rises from his shadow? The morning of August 15th, 2025, began like any other in the marshlands of Chilawa. The air was heavy, the reeds swayed with a deceptive calm, and fishermen pushed their narrow boats through the shallow waters. But above, unseen in the haze, Niger's gamble was already in motion. For weeks, intelligence officers in Niamey had been piecing together a puzzle that had eluded more powerful nations for over a decade. Bakoura had survived French counter-terrorism sweeps, evaded Nigerian offensives, and mocked multinational task forces. He was the kind of enemy who made governments look powerless, a ghost that embarrassed entire armies. Yet in this quiet corner of the Sahel, Niger's own intelligence community began to close in. Using a patchwork of drone footage, satellite imagery, and reports from villagers too tired to remain silent, they tracked movements that matched the patterns of Bakoura's inner circle. A motorcade through reed beds, a night fire that burned longer than cooking flames, a voice, deep and commanding, overheard on a smuggler's radio frequency. Each clue brought the picture into focus. Bakoura was hiding in Chilawa. Niger's military high command faced a choice. They could wait for regional allies, request assistance from foreign powers, and risk the secret slipping away. Or they could act alone, staking their nation's reputation on one decisive strike. The decision was made. Niger would move, not as a pawn of larger powers, but as the master of its own destiny. In the dim hours before dawn, 3 aging fighter jets lifted into the sky. Their engines roared over Difa, startling families who had grown used to the silence of fear. Inside the cockpits sat pilots who knew this mission was more than military. It was history in motion. Their coordinates were fixed, a cluster of huts and hidden bunkers in the marshlands where Bakoura was believed to be meeting his commanders. As the jets approached, villagers nearby heard what they would later describe as the sound of thunder without rain. At 5:42 a.m., the first bomb fell. It struck with surgical precision, scattering flames across the reeds. The second and third followed within seconds, each tearing through the hideouts where Bakoura's fighters had been sleeping. By the time the smoke cleared, more than 24 militants lay dead. Among them was the man who had haunted the Lake Chad Basin for years. News of Bakoura's death spread quickly. At first, some doubted it. He had been killed before in rumors, only to reappear weeks later, mocking governments with new attacks. But this time was different. Military sources released images of the strike zone. Survivors confirmed the loss. Even his own fighters whispered that their commander was gone. For the people of Difa, the reaction was a mix of relief and disbelief. Crowds gathered in markets murmuring, "Is it true? Is he really dead?" Radios crackled with reports of the operation, each update carrying the weight of a long-awaited justice. In one refugee camp, a mother named Hadiza listened with trembling hands. Her son had been among the children taken in the Kuriga kidnapping. For over a year, she had lived in limbo, uncertain if he was alive or gone. When she heard the news, tears ran down her face. Not tears of celebration, but of release. "Maybe now," she whispered, "the children can sleep without nightmares." This was the deeper meaning of the strike. It was not just about eliminating a terrorist leader. It was about restoring dignity to families who had lived under the constant threat of abduction. It was about giving soldiers a reason to believe their sacrifices mattered. It was about proving that Niger, long dismissed as weak and dependent, could act with precision and courage. Yet even in the midst of triumph, doubts lingered. Security analysts warned that Boko Haram was not one man, but a network. Already, whispers spread of other commanders preparing to fill the void. Some pointed to ISWAP, the Islamic State's affiliate in West Africa, eager to absorb Bakoura's fighters. Others feared retaliation, predicting that revenge attacks could strike within days. But for one morning at least, Niger stood taller. In Niamey's war rooms, commanders exchanged firm handshakes, aware that their success had carried enormous risk. If the mission had failed, Niger's army would have been mocked, its people demoralized, its sovereignty questioned. Instead, the gamble paid off. And so, the story of August 15th is not only about what was destroyed in Chilawa, it is about what was declared, that even small nations can strike boldly, that even myths can bleed, and that sovereignty still has a voice in the Sahel. But here lies the haunting question. When one head of the serpent is cut, does peace follow, or does another rise to take its place? In the hours after the bombs fell, the air in Difa was charged with something the region had not felt in years. Silence that was not born of fear, but of anticipation. People gathered in markets and mosques, whispering the same question. Is it true? Is Bakoura finally gone? By noon, Niger's government confirmed the news. State radio announced it with a trembling pride. The leader of terror who tormented our people has been eliminated. The statement was brief, but the weight behind it was immense. Crowds erupted in cautious cheers. Women ululated in celebration, while young men drummed on old oil barrels. Yet even as flags waved in the capital, the relief was tempered with memory. They had buried too many loved ones, rebuilt too many burned villages, to believe that one strike alone would end the nightmare. In the refugee camps of Maiduguri and Difa, the news traveled quickly from tent to tent. Families huddled around transistor radios, eyes wide with hope, but hands still clutching one another in disbelief. A father who had lost his daughter in the Kuriga school kidnapping whispered, "If he is gone, maybe she can come home. Maybe someone will have the courage to bring her back." His words were not a celebration, but a prayer. For soldiers on the front lines, the reaction was electric. Men who had buried comrades after years of ambushes now stood a little taller. One lieutenant, his rifle scarred from battles in Borno, told reporters, "We have chased this ghost for years. Today, we proved he can bleed." His voice cracked with a mix of exhaustion and pride, echoing the sentiment of thousands who had fought too long in a war with no end. But not everyone rejoiced. Fear ran like a current beneath the celebrations. Boko Haram had been declared wounded before, only to return fiercer, more fragmented, more unpredictable. Analysts reminded the public that extremism is not a single man, but an idea that feeds on despair. Already, intelligence suggested that splinter groups were planning retaliatory strikes, hoping to prove that Bakoura's death was not the end. Internationally, the story ricocheted across headlines. African news outlets hailed it as a turning point, a declaration that Niger could act decisively without waiting for foreign powers. In Nairobi and Dakar, radio hosts framed it as the Sahel's bin Laden moment. Western media, however, were more cautious. Commentators in Washington and Paris debated whether Niger had received covert assistance. Some suggested that foreign satellites and drones must have played a role. Others speculated that the strike might destabilize the region further, provoking new waves of violence. But on the ground, symbolism mattered more than speculation. In Niamey's Revolution Square, thousands gathered with candles as the sun set. An imam led a prayer for the victims of Boko Haram, followed by chants of unity. Our land, our rights, our future. For one evening, at least, Niger's people believed they had seized control of their story. Images from the day captured the paradox. Children playing soccer in dusty refugee camps with renewed laughter, soldiers standing guard with sharper resolve, and mothers clutching photos of their missing children, their eyes shimmering between relief and grief. Yet amid the flicker of hope, darker whispers spread. In border villages near Nigeria, people reported fighters vowing revenge. "We will return. We always return." For those who lived closest to the violence, the fear never truly left. They knew too well that the hydra of terror often grows new heads when one is cut. And so, the climax of August 15th carried both triumph and dread. Triumph, because Niger had dared to act boldly and succeeded where others had failed. Dread, because the shadow of revenge hung heavy over the Lake Chad Basin. This is the paradox of victory in the Sahel. Every celebration is laced with unease, every breakthrough shadowed by the question of what comes next. Niger had shattered a myth, but myths, once broken, can also become rallying cries. Would Bakoura's death inspire collapse, or would it turn him into a martyr, fueling another wave of extremism? As night fell on Diffa, the question lingered in every camp, every village, every soldier's heart. History had shifted, but its direction was still uncertain. For the people who live along the Lake Chad Basin, Bakoura's death was not an abstract headline. It was a shift they could feel in their bones, a moment that touched their daily lives. In the refugee camps of Diffa, children began to play outside their tents a little longer before dusk. Farmers who had abandoned their fields cautiously returned to survey the land, running their hands through the dry soil as if testing whether it could hold hope again. One teacher in a camp school explained it simply. "For the first time in years, the children asked me if they could plan for next term. They believed there might be a next term. That fragile belief, the possibility of normal life, was itself revolutionary in a region where violence had long dictated the rhythm of existence. Yet even as daily routines began to flicker back to life, communities carried scars that one strike could not heal. Entire villages had been emptied by Boko Haram's raids. Women who had lost children to kidnappings still lived in limbo, caught between mourning and waiting. Men who had fought in vigilante groups returned home with little more than fatigue and wounds. For them, Bakoura's death was a milestone, but not closure. Politically, the impact was immediate. Niger's government, often described as fragile and dependent on outside support, suddenly found itself standing taller. In Niamey, officials declared the operation a symbol of sovereignty, a proof that Niger could defend itself without waiting for France, the United States, or the United Nations. For many citizens, this struck a deep chord. It was not only about killing a terrorist. It was about reclaiming dignity. The success emboldened discussions within the Sahel Alliance, the partnership between Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. Leaders across the region began to speak with renewed confidence about a future less reliant on foreign troops and more grounded in regional cooperation. Crowds in Bamako and Ouagadougou cheered Niger's achievement as if it were their own, interpreting it as a sign that Africa's most troubled region could write its own story. But beneath the pride lay urgent questions. Could Niger sustain this momentum? Could it translate a military victory into long-term stability? Analysts warned that unless the government invested in rebuilding roads, schools, and local governance, the vacuum left by Bakoura could quickly be filled by others, whether ISWAP, smugglers, or opportunistic warlords. Ordinary citizens understood this better than anyone. A shopkeeper in Diffa put it bluntly, "We need more than bombs. We need bread, water, and safety for our children." His words echoed a lesson that has haunted counterterrorism efforts worldwide. Military action can break a figure, but only development can break the cycle. The impact also rippled into Niger's fragile political balance. For years, the military government had faced criticism from international observers, accused of repressing opposition and curbing freedoms. But the successful strike shifted perceptions at home. Many citizens, once skeptical, now rallied behind their leaders, crediting them with a rare victory against terror. Public approval surged, giving the government political capital it had lacked. At the same time, the operation fueled debates about transparency and accountability. Who provided the intelligence? Was it purely Nigerian capability, or did silent partners lend support? The government insisted it was an independent effort, but whispers of hidden alliances persisted. For citizens, the truth mattered less than the outcome. Yet for the international community, it raised questions about whether Niger's newfound autonomy was as absolute as it claimed. Meanwhile, across the border in Nigeria, the impact was just as palpable. Families who had suffered under Boko Haram cautiously celebrated, but officials in Abuja worried about displaced fighters flooding into their territory. The line between relief and anxiety blurred, as each nation in the Lake Chad Basin braced for what might come next. Perhaps the most profound impact, however, was psychological. For over a decade, Boko Haram thrived on the myth that its leaders could not be defeated. That myth was shattered. Even if splinter groups rise, even if new leaders emerge, the people of the Sahel had seen that the ghost could be killed. This shift in perception, the reclaiming of belief that victory was possible, was as important as the strike itself. But victory is fragile. History in the Sahel has shown that moments of hope can quickly turn to despair if not reinforced by consistent action. Roads must be secured. Markets must reopen. Education must be safeguarded. Without these, Bakoura's death could be remembered not as a turning point, but as another false dawn. And so the civil and political impact of August 15th is best described as a crossroads. One road leads to resilience, communities rebuilding, governments cooperating, sovereignty strengthened. The other leads back into the familiar cycle of violence and abandonment. Which path Niger and its neighbors choose will define not only their future, but the future of the Sahel itself. When the news of Bakoura's death reached foreign capitals, the reactions revealed as much about the world as they did about Niger. In Washington, analysts on morning talk shows cautiously compared the Chilawa strike to America's own raid on Osama bin Laden in 2011. The parallels were striking. A long-hunted enemy, a carefully planned strike, and a wave of relief mixed with dread about what would follow. For U.S. policymakers, Niger's action was both inspiring and unsettling. Inspiring because a small African nation had shown it could act decisively without waiting for foreign command. Unsettling because it raised questions. If Niger can strike boldly, what role remains for the West in a region where it has long claimed to provide security? In Paris, the silence was telling. France, once the dominant military presence in the Sahel, had been pushed out by rising resentment and accusations of neo-colonial control. Now Niger had carried out the kind of precision strike Paris once promised but failed to deliver. Commentators across French media debated whether this was a turning point for Africa's independence or a further retreat of Western influence. Beyond the West, the response was louder. In Nairobi, Dakar, and Johannesburg, radio hosts hailed it as a moment of continental pride. Editorials spoke of Niger breaking the chains of dependency, while young Africans flooded social media with messages of solidarity. Hashtags celebrating Niger's sovereignty trended across the continent, turning the Chilawa strike into a pan-African symbol of defiance. Yet amid the praise, warnings multiplied. International security experts stressed that Boko Haram's death toll, nearly 40,000 lives over the years, was not the work of one man. Networks of smuggling, radical preaching, and foreign financing had kept the group alive. Bakoura's elimination, while historic, did not erase those networks. Some even predicted that ISWAP, the Islamic State's West Africa affiliate, could seize the moment to absorb Bakoura's orphaned fighters. Still, symbolism matters. For decades, Niger was dismissed as a junior partner, a staging ground for other nations' wars. On August 15th, it stood as a protagonist of its own story. And for the world, the message was unmistakable. Sovereignty is not a privilege handed down by great powers. It is a right, claimed in blood and sacrifice. But here lies the cliffhanger. Will the world see Niger's bold act as a reason to support African sovereignty or as a threat to old patterns of control? When the news of Bakoura's death reached foreign capitals, the reactions revealed as much about the world as they did about Niger. In Washington, analysts on morning talk shows cautiously compared the Chilawa strike to America's own raid on Osama bin Laden in 2011. The parallels were striking. A long-hunted enemy, a carefully planned strike, and a wave of relief mixed with dread about what would follow. For U.S. policymakers, Niger's action was both inspiring and unsettling. Inspiring because a small African nation had shown it could act decisively without waiting for foreign command. Unsettling because it raised questions. If Niger can strike boldly, what role remains for the West in a region where it has long claimed to provide security? In Paris, the silence was telling. France, once the dominant military presence in the Sahel, had been pushed out by rising resentment and accusations of neo-colonial control. Now, Niger had carried out the kind of precision strike Paris once promised, but failed to deliver. Commentators across French media debated whether this was a turning point for Africa's independence or a further retreat of Western influence. Beyond the West, the response was louder. In Nairobi, Dakar, and Johannesburg, radio hosts hailed it as a moment of continental pride. Editorials spoke of Niger breaking the chains of dependency, while young Africans flooded social media with messages of solidarity. Hashtags celebrating Niger's sovereignty trended across the continent, turning the Chilawa strike into a pan-African symbol of defiance. Yet, amid the praise, warnings multiplied. International security experts stressed that Boko Haram's death toll, nearly 40,000 lives over the years, was not the work of one man. Networks of smuggling, radical preaching, and foreign financing had kept the group alive. Bakoura's elimination, while historic, did not erase those networks. Some even predicted that ISWAP, the Islamic State's West Africa affiliate, could seize the moment to absorb Bakoura's orphaned fighters. Still, symbolism matters. For decades, Niger was dismissed as a junior partner, a staging ground for other nations' wars. On August 15th, it stood as a protagonist of its own story. And for the world, the message was unmistakable. Sovereignty is not a privilege handed down by great powers. It is a right, claimed in blood and sacrifice. But here lies the cliffhanger. Will the world see Niger's bold act as a reason to support African sovereignty or as a threat to old patterns of control?